The battlefield was a desolate wasteland, a place where human life had become little more than a fleeting moment, quickly extinguished by the merciless hand of war. The air, thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder, seemed to press down on the men like an invisible weight, suffocating their thoughts. The ground beneath their feet was torn apart, pockmarked with craters from the relentless barrage of artillery. Shattered trees and debris from destroyed tanks lay scattered around, like the broken remnants of a once vibrant world. Yet amidst this scene of destruction, a group of German soldiers stood in solemn formation, their faces grim and their eyes locked in a shared resolve. The quiet before the storm hung heavy in the air, a silence that spoke more of impending violence than peace. For these soldiers, the idea of revenge was no abstract concept. It was a living, breathing force, a fire that burned hot within them, driving them forward with a singular purpose. They had already tasted the bitterness of loss so profound that it seemed to carve deep scars into their souls. Their comrades had fallen, their friends reduced to nothing more than names on a list, faces forever frozen in the final moments before death. And for all that they had endured, they had been left with little more than the haunting memories of battlefields scattered across Europe, where every corner turned seemed to hold another ambush, another tragedy. They had witnessed death in its most grotesque forms, yet somehow it had failed to break their resolve. If anything, it had only hardened it. Now, they stood poised, their bodies tense, fingers tight around the grips of their rifles. Every man knew his role. Every man knew what would come next. They had been trained to kill, to fight with brutal efficiency, to face their enemies without hesitation. The British forces had not been kind to them. The soldiers they faced were not faceless abstractions. They were the perpetrators of pain, the architects of suffering. And for the men in this formation, revenge was not just a desire, it was a moral imperative. The enemy had taken from them, and it was their turn to strike back, to reclaim what had been lost. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the battlefield, reminding them that the war was far from over. Yet, in the moment of quiet before the battle would rage anew, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what had been lost, not only in terms of comrades but in terms of something far more insidious. The soldiers could no longer see the world as it had once been. They had become something else in the heat of conflict, tools of war, stripped of the humanity that had once defined them. Each man carried with him the burden of guilt, shame, and anger, emotions that had taken root over time and festered in the silence of the night. But amidst the horror, there was still that burning need for revenge. For every fallen comrade, there would be a price to pay. And so, the soldiers waited, their eyes scanning the horizon, watching for any sign of the British troops they were about to face. In that moment, there was a sense of clarity among them. The battlefield was not just a place of conflict. It was a place where something deeper, something far more personal, was being decided. Revenge was no longer about the politics of war. It was about something more visceral, more primal. It was about honor, about justice, about the need to make things right in a world that had been turned upside down. They had been told that they were fighting for their country, for their families, for their futures. But in truth, what they were fighting for now was the chance to restore the balance, to avenge the dead, to make their enemies feel the same pain that had been visited upon them. The waiting was unbearable, the tension mounting with each passing second. The soldiers exchanged glances, each one knowing that what lay ahead would not be easy. War had a way of stripping away the illusion of heroism, leaving only the raw reality of death and destruction. In that moment, they were not soldiers. They were men, mere mortals standing on the edge of something much larger than themselves. The air grew heavier as the sounds of distant artillery grew louder, and they knew that their time was coming. The British soldiers would soon be within their grasp, and when they were, there would be no mercy. Their commander, a grizzled veteran who had seen countless battles, stood at the front, his face a mask of stoic determination. He had lived through enough wars to understand the brutal nature of the conflict they were in. He knew what was at stake, and he knew what the men needed to hear. But there were no words of encouragement this time, no speeches to rally the troops. This battle was different. It was personal. They did not need to be reminded of their duty, they already understood it all too well. There would be no rallying cry, no call to arms. Only the quiet murmur of breath, the sound of hearts pounding, and the inevitable clash that would follow. As the soldiers waited, the thoughts of each man turned inward. Each one reflected on the choices that had brought them here. Some had joined the army with a sense of duty, others out of a need to escape the mundane existence they had left behind. But in the end, it didn't matter why they had enlisted. What mattered now was survival, and the bitter desire to make those who had wronged them pay. There was no room for fear, no space for hesitation. Revenge was a fire that consumed everything in its path, and it would not be extinguished until it had burned through every ounce of their resolve. The distant rumble of tanks drew their attention. The British forces were approaching. The soldiers straightened, their muscles coiling in preparation for the coming onslaught. The time for waiting was over. In just a few moments, they would face the British soldiers, and in that moment, all the months of training, of suffering, would be put to the test. This was no longer a war between nations. It was a war between men, driven by something far deeper than politics or strategy. The first shots rang out across the field, and the battlefield exploded into chaos. The soldiers, now fully immersed in the violence of war, forgot everything except the enemy before them. The brutal efficiency of the fight was like a dance they had performed countless times before, each movement instinctive, each action designed to destroy. There was no room for second thoughts now. The desire for revenge had consumed them completely. But in the midst of the chaos, as bullets whizzed by and explosions rocked the ground, there was a brief, fleeting moment where time seemed to stand still. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the violence of war had stopped, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The German soldiers, their minds clouded by rage, found themselves caught in a moment of unexpected clarity. And then, in the next instant, the world erupted again, and they were back in the nightmare, chasing the very vengeance that had brought them here. The noise, the chaos, the bloodshed, it was all part of the war they had chosen. There was no turning back now. In that moment of battle, one thing was certain: revenge was a powerful thing. It could drive men to unspeakable acts, to sacrifice everything for the hope of making things right. But it could also strip away the last remnants of humanity, leaving behind only the bare bones of a soldier who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The German soldiers, trapped in this cycle of violence, would soon learn that revenge, once unleashed, is a force that is impossible to control. And in its wake, it would leave them with nothing but the wreckage of their souls. The sound of gunfire faded into the distance as the two armies, once poised to clash, found themselves locked in a moment of surreal silence. The soldiers stood there, their faces painted with the weariness of war, their bodies tense with the knowledge that violence could explode at any second. The battlefield was no longer just a landscape of mud and smoke. It had become a stage for something else, a scene that neither side could have foreseen, a moment that defied the logic of combat. For the German soldiers, their minds were still focused on the one thing they had come to the field for: vengeance. The loss of their comrades, the destruction of their plans, and the relentless pursuit of their enemies had pushed them to this moment. There was no room for doubt in their minds. Their only thought was to strike back, to make the British pay for every life they had taken, every sacrifice they had forced them to endure. They had been trained to see the enemy as something other than human, a force that needed to be eradicated for the greater good of their cause. But now, as they stood face to face with the British soldiers, something unexpected began to stir in them, a confusion, a hesitation that felt foreign, out of place. The British soldiers, too, were caught in a moment of tension. They had been through their own battles, their own losses, their own moments of despair. But they had also come to understand the futility of this endless conflict, the pointlessness of continuing to fight for reasons that had long ceased to make sense. They were not here for glory or honor. They were here because they had been ordered to be, because this war had forced them into roles they could not escape. Their eyes, though weary, were not filled with hatred. They had seen too much death to continue to believe in the righteousness of it all. What they sought now was survival, not victory. They wanted an end, not more bloodshed. And yet, despite their fatigue, despite the toll the war had taken on them, they stood at attention, their rifles at the ready, their minds sharpened by the discipline that had been instilled in them over months of brutal training. They were ready for whatever was to come, but they did not expect the scene that was unfolding before them. As the two groups of soldiers stood at a distance, the air thick with the tension of the moment, something unexpected happened. It was not a battle cry that broke the silence. It was not a shot fired in anger. Instead, it was the simple act of one British soldier stepping forward, slowly, deliberately, as though his movements had been preordained. He was carrying a canteen, and without a word he approached one of the German soldiers. The soldier's face was hardened, his eyes narrowed, as if preparing for the worst. He had been taught to see these men as enemies, to see them as nothing more than obstacles in the path of their mission. But now, as he stood face to face with the British soldier, he found himself at a loss. The British soldier offered the canteen, his gaze calm but unwavering. He made no threats, no demands. There were no shouts of "surrender" or "drop your weapons." There was no triumphant moment of conquest. There was only the offer of water, an act so simple, so mundane, that it seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time. For a moment, the German soldier stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to retaliate, to strike back at the enemy who had dared to approach him without fear. But something in the British soldier's expression stopped him. There was no hatred there, no contempt, no judgment, only a quiet, almost serene gesture of kindness. It was as if the man before him was offering not just water, but an invitation to something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the war they were fighting. It was an invitation to see one another as human beings. The other German soldiers watched in stunned silence, unable to understand what was happening. Their hands remained tightly gripped around their weapons, their bodies still tense and poised for the inevitable clash. They had been raised in an environment where such an act of kindness was unthinkable from the enemy. They had been told that the British were not just their opponents, they were the embodiment of everything they had been taught to despise. And yet, here was one of them, offering something as simple as water, an act that transcended the lines of the battlefield. The moment felt like a rupture in the very fabric of the war they were fighting. The German soldier, still wary, took a cautious step forward. His hand reached for the canteen, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. There was a slight tremor in his hand, a sign of the uncertainty that had begun to creep into his heart. He had not expected this. He had not been prepared for this moment of human connection, and yet here it was, challenging everything he thought he knew about the enemy. As he took the canteen from the British soldier, he felt a strange surge of relief, as if the simple act of drinking water could wash away the bitterness of the years he had spent on the front lines, fighting for a cause that now seemed so distant, so irrelevant. He drank slowly, savoring the coolness of the water as it slid down his throat. For a moment, it felt as if the chaos of the battlefield had receded, as if time had slowed down, and he was just a man, standing in the presence of another man. The noise of the war, the gunfire, the explosions, all seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of breathing of life itself. It was a moment of peace, brief as it was, and in that moment, the soldier could not help but wonder why they were fighting in the first place. The British soldier, standing silently by, did not speak. He did not need to. His gesture had said everything. The moment had passed, and the reality of war would soon come crashing back. But for now, there was a shared understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were not so different after all. The British soldier had shown him a glimpse of something beyond the enemy lines, beyond the hatred and violence. He had shown him what it meant to be human. The other German soldiers, still in a state of disbelief, looked on, their minds racing with the implications of what they had just witnessed. They had always been taught to fight with honor, to fight for their country, for their comrades. But what honor was there in this endless cycle of bloodshed? What had they truly accomplished by killing, by destroying, by maiming? They had been told that they were fighting for a greater good, for a cause greater than themselves. But in this moment, as they watched one of their own accept water from the enemy, they began to question what that cause really meant. For the British soldiers, the moment was equally profound, though in a different way. They had been trained to kill, to follow orders, to never hesitate in the face of the enemy. But standing before the German soldiers, offering water instead of a bullet, They were confronted with a stark reality. These men, these enemies, were not so different from them. They, too, were fighting for survival, for something they believed in, whether it was right or wrong. And in this brief, fragile moment, the lines that had been drawn between them began to blur. They were not just soldiers in an abstract war, they were men who had been caught in something much larger than themselves. The stillness that hung in the air between them was not one of peace, but of something much more complicated. It was a recognition that the violence they had been part of was not an answer. It was a perpetuation of suffering, of loss. There was no glory in this war, no triumph to be had. There were only men, struggling to survive in a world that had forgotten how to be human. And in this fleeting moment, that truth was laid bare. The world around them had come to a standstill. It was a peculiar, almost eerie kind of silence that enveloped the men from both sides. The battlefield, usually a place of chaos, gunfire, and destruction, had momentarily become an empty stage, where nothing but the raw humanity of the situation remained. The distant thrum of artillery, the usual soundtrack of war, had been drowned out by something far more profound, the quiet hesitation that gripped every soldier present. The British soldier, still holding the canteen, offered it to the German soldier who had, only moments ago, been ready to fight, to kill. There was no grand speech, no dramatic call for peace, just the simple, almost naive gesture of offering water in the midst of a war. For the German soldier, it was a surreal moment, one that felt like it was happening to someone else. In a world built on orders, discipline, and the ever-present threat of violence, this act of kindness, this offering of something as basic and human as water, seemed to shatter the very foundation of what he had come to understand about war. It was a paradox. The very enemy he had been trained to see as nothing more than a target, a faceless entity, had shown him the most intimate form of respect, a gesture that, in its simplicity, carried more weight than any bullet ever could. The soldier's hand hesitated before reaching for the canteen. It was not fear that stopped him, but something deeper, something more troubling. He had been on the front lines long enough to know that hesitation was often the difference between life and death, but in this moment he couldn't bring himself to pull away. The water was offered not with a weapon, not with the cold efficiency of an enemy intent on obliterating him, but with the humanity of someone who, despite the division between them, still saw him as a man. The hesitation was almost imperceptible, but to the soldiers watching, it was an unmistakable sign that something was shifting, something deep within the core of this seemingly unchangeable war. Finally, his hand closed around the canteen. He brought it to his lips, and as the water flowed into his mouth, it felt as though time had slowed. The taste of it was almost foreign, cool and refreshing, but it was also something more. It was an anchor, a moment of grounding that pulled him out of the constant turmoil of the battlefield, if only for a few seconds. There was a sense of relief, yes, but there was also an undercurrent of disbelief. He looked into the eyes of the British soldier, still holding his gaze. The connection was unspoken, yet it was as if both men understood the depth of what had just transpired. This was not the enemy he had been taught to hate, to destroy. This was a man, another man caught in the same brutal cycle of violence, just as trapped as he was. And for the first time since he had put on his uniform, he wondered if there had ever been a true enemy at all. The British soldier did not smile, nor did he seek thanks. He simply stood there, watching the German soldier drink. His expression remained neutral, but there was something else in his eyes, an understanding, a shared recognition that they were no longer just soldiers locked in a senseless fight. They were human beings who had somehow found themselves on opposite sides of a war that had reduced their lives to mere cannon fodder. The British soldier's gesture had not been one of heroism or mercy. It had been an acknowledgement of the simple truth that they were both, at their core, the same. In a world that had stripped them of their identities, of their individual stories, this small act of kindness was an attempt to remind them of that shared humanity. And, in turn, it served to remind the German soldier of his own humanity, which had been buried beneath the weight of duty, revenge, and the constant threat of death. For the other German soldiers standing nearby, the sight of one of their own accepting water from the enemy was nothing short of a revelation. They had been trained to see the British as monsters, cold, ruthless, and unfeeling. They had been taught that the British were the enemy, the ones who had to be defeated at all costs, no matter the price. They had learned to dehumanize them, to treat them not as men but as obstacles, as pieces on a chessboard that could be sacrificed without a second thought. But now, as they watched one of their own soldiers drink from the hand of the enemy, they were confronted with the uncomfortable reality that the men they had been fighting were not so different from themselves. The air was thick with a tension so profound that it seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The other German soldiers glanced at each other, their eyes flickering with confusion, with uncertainty. What was happening here? Why had the British soldier chosen this moment, this action, to offer peace in the midst of war? And what did it mean for them, for the soldiers who had been fighting for so long under the banner of revenge? What did it mean to be at war, to hate and to kill, when the very thing they had been trained to do, fight, destroy, conquer, was now suddenly turned on its head by a single act of humanity? One of the soldiers, unable to contain his thoughts any longer, shifted his weight and took a cautious step forward. His hand was still gripping the rifle, and his eyes flicked nervously toward his comrades, as though seeking their approval or perhaps reassurance. But none came. His gaze returned to the British soldier, who stood quietly in front of him, still waiting. There was no movement from the British side, no rush to turn this moment into an advantage, no sudden attack. It was just stillness, the kind of stillness that only the rawness of war can create. For a moment, the German soldier wondered if they had all been wrong. Perhaps this war, this endless cycle of bloodshed, had never been about winning or losing. Perhaps it had always been about something much darker, something that had clouded their judgment for far too long. The tension in the air thickened as the British soldier, seemingly aware of the unspoken thoughts that were swirling among the German ranks, slowly began to step back. He did not rush. There was no need for it. He had already done what he came to do. The simple act of offering the canteen had spoken volumes, and now he returned to his comrades, leaving behind only the echo of that strange, fleeting moment of peace. For the German soldiers, the world suddenly felt different. Their grip on their rifles tightened once again, but it was not out of readiness for battle, it was out of something else. Something far more difficult to process. They had been taught to hold on to hatred, to cling to their mission, to take revenge for those they had lost. But in that single moment, they had witnessed the fragility of that hatred. They had been confronted with the unsettling truth that war, and the animosity that fueled it, was not as simple as they had been led to believe. It was not just a matter of who won or who lost. It was a matter of what had been lost in the first place. What had been sacrificed in the name of vengeance. As the British soldiers began to pull back, the German soldiers remained frozen in place. They stood together, side by side, but it was clear that something had shifted. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if they had been paralyzed by the sheer weight of what they had just experienced. It was a moment they would not soon forget, perhaps because it was a moment they could not fully understand. It was a moment that did not fit into the framework of war they had grown up in, a framework that had been so carefully constructed to ensure that no questions were ever asked, no doubts ever raised. But now, in the silence that followed, those questions began to bubble to the surface. The water, the canteen, the offer of humanity, those small gestures were now branded into their memories, impossible to erase. And so, they stood, not as soldiers, but as men caught in the most profound of contradictions. The war continued around them, but in this brief, fleeting moment, they had glimpsed the possibility of something else, something more human than they had ever known. The moment stretched on, far longer than it should have. The echoes of gunfire and the rumbling of distant artillery felt like they were from another world entirely, as if the chaos of war had somehow been suspended in time. The battlefield was frozen, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that everything was momentarily put on hold by an unspoken understanding, a fragile moment of humanity that hung in the air like a delicate thread. The German soldiers stood there, still gripped by the intensity of what had just occurred. For so long, they had been conditioned to see their enemies not as men, but as obstacles, faceless figures to be destroyed in the pursuit of victory. But now, in the wake of the simple act of kindness, the offer of water, without words, without any demand or expectation. They were left adrift, their thoughts tangled in a knot of confusion. The man who had taken the water stood motionless for a long moment, still holding the canteen, the cool liquid still resting in his throat, his body locked in a moment of reflection. It was as if, for that fleeting instant, he had stepped out of the war, out of the soldier he had been, and into a place where things were not defined by uniforms or battle lines. There was only the sense of being human, a feeling that had been long buried beneath the weight of orders and the demands of survival. He didn't know why the British soldier had done it, why he had extended that simple gesture of compassion, but somehow, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it had happened. For a brief moment, the hate, the endless conflict, the loss, all of it had fallen away, replaced by something far more elusive but infinitely more powerful, a recognition of shared existence. And in the aftermath of that recognition, he could not shake the nagging question that haunted his mind. Why had they been fighting in the first place? There were no answers, of course. There couldn't be. The war was larger than any one man, any one soldier. It was a machine, a force that chewed up lives and spat them out without regard for the individuals who were caught in its path. But in the quiet of that moment, as the soldiers stood on either side of one another, something began to shift. It wasn't something that could be easily explained, nor was it something they could talk about without risking the fragile peace they had found, however temporary it might be. But they all knew that things had changed, that the war, for all its devastation and destruction, had created something more, something that had not been there before. The other German soldiers were not as still as their comrade. They moved, shifted uneasily, casting furtive glances at the British soldiers standing across from them. Some of them still clutched their rifles tightly, their instincts telling them to fall back into the rhythm of the war, to resume the battle that had been so abruptly interrupted. They had been trained to fight without hesitation, without compassion. They had been taught that the enemy was nothing more than an obstacle to be destroyed. But now, in the wake of the simple human gesture that had just unfolded before them, they were unsure of what to do. The anger that had once fueled them seemed to dissipate into the air, leaving behind only a vague sense of loss. Their minds, once clouded by the fog of hatred and revenge, were now struggling to make sense of what had just happened. One soldier, his hands still gripping his rifle, took a step forward. His face was hardened, but his eyes were uncertain, flicking between his comrades and the British soldiers, who stood quietly in the same tense silence. He looked back at the man who had taken the water. The soldier was still standing there, his eyes distant, lost in thought, as if he had momentarily drifted away from the violence that surrounded them. There was no joy in the moment, no satisfaction. The war had not been won or lost. Nothing had changed in terms of the grand narrative of the battle. And yet, in that brief encounter, something had shifted within the German soldier. He could feel it, deep in his chest, like a knot loosening inside him. It was not a feeling of victory, nor was it one of defeat. It was a feeling of something more profound, something that existed beyond the battlefield, beyond the propaganda and the nationalistic pride that had shaped his identity for so long. The British soldiers had not moved either. They remained in place, a quiet calm about them, no signs of victory or triumph in their demeanor. They had simply done what they had done, offered water, extended humanity where it was least expected. And now they waited. For what, they were not sure. The battle would inevitably resume, that was certain. But for now, they were bound by a quiet understanding, a brief, shared moment that spoke louder than any bullet ever could. Their commander had given no orders to advance, no orders to retreat. It was as though they were simply waiting for something, the next move, the next wave of violence, the inevitable return to their roles as soldiers. But in the stillness of the moment, it was as if they, too, were caught in a space between the war they had been fighting and something else entirely, something that neither side could fully comprehend, let alone articulate. And so they waited. The German soldier who had taken the water was still frozen in place, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the two realities he had been thrust between. On the one hand, there was the reality of war, the reality that had been drummed into him since he first picked up a rifle, the world of orders and missions and the relentless pursuit of victory. But on the other hand, there was this moment, this strange, inexplicable moment that had broken the rules, that had blurred the lines between enemy and ally, between soldier and man. The others were waiting too. The silence stretched on, and the battlefield seemed distant, removed from the present moment. The men stood there, a shared uncertainty between them. Their roles as enemies, as soldiers locked in mortal combat, seemed far less clear now. It was as though the simple act of sharing water had broken something within them, something deep and irretrievable. It was as though they had been shown a different way of seeing the world, one that was not defined by uniforms, flags, or the cold logic of strategy, but by something far more elemental. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, the German soldiers found themselves caught between the instinct to fight and the urge to understand, to question. They had been taught to hate without question, to fight without hesitation. But now, they were faced with the unsettling reality that the men they had been fighting against, the men they had been told were monsters, were, in fact, human beings like them. And that truth, it was almost too much to bear. How could they reconcile this moment of kindness with the brutality of the war they had been told to fight? How could they make sense of the realization that they were no longer just soldiers, but men who had been caught in something far larger than themselves? The weight of this realization hung heavy in the air. The moments dragged on. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though they were all frozen, not by fear or by threat, but by something far deeper, by the sudden awareness that the war, for all its bloodshed, had not brought them what they had expected. It had not brought them glory, nor had it brought them honor. It had only brought them sorrow, loss, and the destruction of the very humanity they had once taken for granted. And now, in this fleeting moment, they had been shown a glimmer of something else, something that threatened to upend everything they had believed about themselves, about their mission, and about the world they had been fighting for. And so, in the stillness of that shared moment, the world of war seemed to fade away. It was not gone, not permanently. It was still there, lingering at the edges, waiting to come crashing back in as it always did. But for now, for this brief and precious moment, the soldiers on both sides had seen something in each other that could not be unseen. They had seen the potential for peace, for humanity, for connection. And though the battle would inevitably resume, though the war would continue its relentless march forward, this moment, this fragile moment, would never fade from their memories. It would remain, always, as a reminder of what could have been. The moment of stillness in the battlefield, where time seemed to pause in the wake of the simple, shared act of humanity, began to slowly unravel as the weight of reality pressed back down on the soldiers. The strange tension that had hung in the air, the delicate thread that had briefly connected these two sides in a way that neither could have imagined, was slowly fraying. The German soldiers, still standing motionless, now began to feel the weight of their roles return. They had been caught in something almost unrecognizable, something that had for a fleeting moment pierced through the hardened shell of their military training and the indoctrination that had defined their lives for so long. But the world of war, the one they had been born into, the one that demanded their loyalty and their obedience, was not so easily dismissed. It called them back, like a siren song, pulling them away from the fragile peace they had briefly touched. The British soldiers, too, had felt the weight of the moment, though in a different way. They had been standing, still, quiet, offering no resistance to the silence that had wrapped itself around them like a shroud. They had offered no words of encouragement, no plea for understanding. They had simply given water, a human act in the midst of a human disaster. But now, as the seconds passed, the reality of their situation began to press in on them. The war had not stopped. It had merely taken a brief pause, and that pause was now rapidly fading away, slipping through their fingers like sand. They had, in that moment, seen the enemy not as the faceless, nameless group they had been told to fight, but as men who shared the same fears, the same losses, the same need for survival. And that understanding was both profound and paralyzing. It left them wondering, with a sinking feeling, what the hell they were doing here, in this place, at this time, doing something that seemed so meaningless in the face of what they had just witnessed.